Remembering Jamal Khashoggi 100 days after his murder, Turkey wants the Saudi suspects to stand trial in Istanbul. Will justice ever be served, or will diplomatic and trade links overrule human rights principles? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. 100 days since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, friends, politicians and human rights activists have all been honoring the Saudi journalist. They organized a vigil at the Saudi Consulate in Istanbul, where he was killed 3 months ago, and a memorial service was held in the U.S. Congress in Washington. Some members are pressuring President Trump to reevaluate relations with Saudi Arabia and its Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's widely suspected of ordering the killing.
If we decide that commercial interest should override the statements that we make and the actions that we take, then we must admit that we have lost all moral authority to talk about any atrocities anywhere, anytime. We must carry on Khashoggi's mission to defend the free press, our strongest bulwark against injustice.
And friends and former colleagues of Jamal Khashoggi are stepping up their demands for justice.
This story is not just about the murder of one innocent journalist. Jamal's killing is part of an escalating attack against press freedom that's being waged by tyrants around the world. And that's why we can't just let Jamal's story fade away. His assassination, in many ways, I believe, is a red line. It's a threshold where those who believe in human rights and those who believe in free speech must stand firm against those who would callously snuff them out.
Well, let's look back at the main events in the murder investigation. Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd. 8 days later, Turkish investigators identified 19 Saudi suspects. They included a so-called hit squad. Detectives say the 15-man team killed Khashoggi and dismembered his body. In November, the U.S. Treasury imposed sanctions on 17 Saudis, among them the royal court advisor Saud al-Qahtani. A few days later, U.S. media reported the CIA's conclusion that the Saudi Crown Prince ordered the killing. President Donald Trump defended Mohammed bin Salman, saying, "We may never know all of the facts." The U.S. Senate passed a resolution last month holding Mohammed bin Salman responsible. Saudi Arabia said it put 11 suspects on trial last week, but didn't name them. Turkey's leaders say the culprits should stand trial in Istanbul, and if the Saudis refuse to hand them over, they'll be tried in absentia. Well, let's bring in our panel now. From Istanbul, Matthew Bryza, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and former White House official. In Beirut, we have Rami, Professor of Journalism at the American University of Beirut and non-resident Senior Fellow at Harvard University. And from Cornwall in the UK on Skype, David Hay, human rights lawyer and co-founder of the legal consultancy Sterling Hay and Detained International. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Rami, Khoury, Jamal Khashoggi was your friend. Has anything positive come about in the last 100 days that make you hopeful that justice will be served for Jamal?
I would say yes. There are some hopeful signs as well as some negative ones. The most interesting, I think, and significant thing is the incredible breadth, depth, and continuity of serious international concern about what happened to Khashoggi, about the behavior of the Saudi government, the apparent connections with the Crown Prince, his office clearly, him possibly, and the lying that the Saudis did for a month or two about this, the cover-up. These things have generated tremendous pushback internationally in the media and civil society, some businesses, and government actions, in some cases postponing weapons deals and things like that. So the intrusion into the governance system and the actions of the Saudi government at the highest level, at the Crown Prince's level. The Crown Prince effectively runs the country. At the very highest level, this intrusion is unprecedented. It's continuing, and it's going to probably get more intense when the American Congress fully expresses itself with legislation in the coming weeks, probably.
Matthew, Bryza in Istanbul, your thoughts. Has anything concrete been done to bring justice to this gruesome murder?
Well, nothing in the sense of a legal case that's seen the light of day and an actual prosecution. That's true. One step that could be taken would be to renew calls for an international investigation, an international tribunal to try the perpetrators of this murder. But the political winds have shifted, I think, quite dramatically in Washington. Again, that's not bringing justice to the murderers, but that is changing the climate dramatically. We've already seen in the U.S. Senate a bipartisan vote, 56-41, condemning the murder, and bin Salman, the Crown Prince. And I think, well, we've seen a precipitous drop in foreign direct investment into Saudi Arabia since Mr. Khashoggi's death. So there are consequences, but still not justice.
You say the political winds have shifted, Matthew, but Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, delivered a speech in Cairo on U.S. foreign policy on Thursday with zero mention of Jamal Khashoggi. The U.S. Senate, as you say, passed a resolution holding the Crown Prince responsible, and yet we have seen nothing else since. So do you expect any further action from the White House or from Congress?
I don't expect anything from the White House. I expect the White House to resist this tooth and nail and try to sweep it all under the rug, which is essentially what Secretary Pompeo's speech in Cairo tried to do. But at the same time, I definitely expect more action in Congress. As I said a moment ago, that resolution enjoyed bipartisan support. Many Republicans, President Trump's closest ally in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, has been one of the most outspoken critics of Mohammed bin Salman for many things, especially the murder of Jamal. So I think we'll see the House of Representatives vote on that resolution, in fact, that was passed by the Senate, now that the Democrats have taken over. And I think we may see further steps beyond what the Congress voted in December to stop U.S. aid deliveries for the war in Yemen. We may, or stop U.S. action in Yemen. Sorry, we may see an actual end of the weapons deliveries voted in by the Congress.
All right, David Hay in Cornwall. As Matthew says there are growing calls for an international investigation. Amnesty International, in fact, says the only thing that will guarantee justice is an international investigation under the auspices of the United Nations. What needs to happen for the U.S. to get involved? Is it just up to Turkey, or are other Western countries also needing to be involved at this stage?
Well, I mean, I agree with that. I think we only need to look at for want of a better phrase, something of an international Game of Thrones, if you like, of politics and commercial interests. Even in one country, the US, we see the president on one side, the Senate, the CII on the other. And when we then look at that and compare it to the legal side, I agree that the United Nations and some form of special tribunal involving Turkey, perhaps similar to the tribunal used in Lebanon, is the way forward. Because clearly what is happening in Saudi hasn't been set up in accordance with international principles of justice. And also, when we look at Turkey, it's clear that Saudi will not send the people to Turkey. So in terms of real justice for Jamal, holding court and hearings in either country where the others are either never going to be extradited or are not present isn't going to get real justice.
Yeah. So you believe that a trial in absentia that Turkey is calling for right now is not going to achieve anything?
Well, it will achieve, no doubt, convictions against the individuals, but the individuals will remain in Saudi. Now, that you may be able to have, holds on their travel, but if they don't intend to travel, what justice is that for Jamal?
All right, let's bring back Rami into the conversation. Rami, on Turkey's role here, Turkey, many people will say, has a responsibility to continue putting the pressure on the international community for justice to be achieved for Jamal Khashoggi. But is Turkey, in the current geopolitical context, still willing to put that pressure? Is Turkey still willing to be at the forefront of the quest for justice for Jamal Khashoggi?
It's not clear if Turkey is going to keep the pressure up. and if it's going to keep demanding justice for Jamal Khashoggi, or if it's going to make deals with the United States and the Saudis and others for things like containment of the Kurdish wishes or other issues. But Turkey is not on trial here. The Saudi killers and liars and cover-uppers and assassins and butchers and body-dissolving ambassadors, those are the people who are on trial. And this is really the central question that we have to keep our focus on. And I would just add one point. The beginning, you had a clip showing the people in the United States talking about press freedom and press freedom. This is way beyond press freedom. And Jamal acknowledged this in his life. He was a journalist, but this is about the dignity of 400 million Arab people, men and women, all over the Arab world, who simply want to live a decent, normal, dignified life, not to be lied to, not to be threatened, not to be curtailed in their human ambitions, to live a normal, decent life. And the media is just one dimension of this and free expression, but it goes way beyond that. It's a question of decent citizenship in Arab countries. And this is a huge battle. And one of the reasons that people are fighting back in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain and Egypt and other places in the Arab world, they're pushing back against this is because they don't want to have normal citizenship for their people. They want to maintain an autocratic, authoritarian system of rule, and they have allies in Netanyahu and Israel and Trump in the United States. So this is a battle that's going to go on for some time throughout the region and the world.
A battle that's going to go on for some time, Rami Khoury says. Matthew, what do you see as standing in the way of an international independent investigation?
Well, the main thing is a lack of leadership by the executive branch of the United States government. I mean, I think, meaning President Trump himself, he is never going to show that leadership. Obviously, he's going to do everything he possibly can to, as I said, to hide the facts. He is at war with the free press. He calls it fake news. He despises the Washington Post, where Jamal had his column. So you'll get no leadership out of the White House. If the Congress does what I was predicting it will do, as I said before, that will generate some momentum, and perhaps Turkey will feel that it's got sufficient political cover to take a risk of further antagonizing Saudi Arabia, with which it has poor relations, and as we just heard, with which it is likely maybe to be able to do something for the United States, quote unquote, in terms of helping to contain Iran. So I think Turkey would probably be the most likely candidate to call for that investigation if there's some U.S. leadership. But
there's some people who say, Matthew, though, that Turkey has been somewhat dialing back because of perhaps a deal made between Trump and Erdogan. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I see no evidence of that. It's certainly possible. I think equally plausible is that Turkey has, and President Erdogan and his intelligence services, et cetera, law enforcement agencies, they've run out of salacious details. I mean, if it wasn't for the Turkish government's leak of the details of this horrendous crime, we probably still wouldn't know them. So I think I've always been thinking at some point they run out of things to leak, and then Turkey's leverage is gone. So I think now Turkey has to decide, does it want to try to recreate some more leverage by virtue of calling for this international tribunal?
David Hay, just coming back to the legal aspect for a moment, there's a trial that's underway in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia said this week or last week that 11 of the suspects were brought before a judge in the first criminal court of Riyadh, but none of the suspects were named. Very little detail of what was actually happening in that courtroom. Is there, do you think, anyone who believes that the Saudis are serious about achieving justice?
I think it's fairly clear, and the United Nations have already indicated that those hearings are not being held in accordance with international principles. And I think it's fairly clear that this is nothing more than a show trial. And in a, for want of a better phrase, a bad PR stunt, essentially, to try and cover up what's happened, and it's not going to work. But they are obviously going to pursue that. They are obviously going to, one would imagine, come to a conclusion that people are guilty of Jamal's murder. And they will then, I would imagine, try and sweep that under the carpet. You'll then, I imagine, also then have Turkey pursuing action. And the reality, as we said earlier, is that the only body, I believe, that's able to actually have some effect will be some form of special tribunal set up with Turkey and the UN and the international community.
The UN, as you know, is also politicized to some extent. I mean, will a UN-led investigation really bring the real perpetrators and those who ordered the crime to justice?
Well, that's the issue that I was going to raise. So we're obviously looking at the individuals that carried out these unspeakable acts, but it's also about the people that ordered them. Now, obviously, Turkey in the West is pointing at the Crown Prince. Did it go higher? Did it go to the king? And if so, how can we hold those people to account and bring them to justice for Jamal? Is the UN able to do that? It's a question which is very difficult to answer.
Rami, Khoury, your thoughts on the UN's role here? Will they be able to bring the perpetrators to justice if indeed this case was referred to the UN?
Experience shows that the UN can do nothing if one of the 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members, doesn't want it done and issues a veto. It seems like the United States under Trump is going to continue opposing any serious international investigation into this murder unless something happens to change the Trump position, which is unlikely, but we can't completely rule it out. It's possible something might happen and Trump might realize that he just simply has to go along with an international investigation. But I doubt that we're going to get anything out of the United Nations. It's interesting that the main sources of pressure on the Saudis for the last 100 days have been civil society, the media all over the world, and some political personalities individually rather than large political groupings, with a couple of governments coming in here and there. So I think we should expect that kind of diverse, diffused pressure to keep persisting in pressuring the Saudis as much as possible.
Matthew, in Istanbul, it's not just Turkey, it's not just the US, even though the US has a big role in this, of course. What about the rest of the international community, Western countries, Germany, the UK? Can we count on support from some of these countries, or have trade and diplomatic relations basically overruled any human rights principles here?
I think we should be relying on them. I think that going back to Folly's comment about the Arab world and its dignity, this is an issue that transcends any geographic boundaries. As I was saying about President Trump's war on the free media, this is about the fundamental values of all democracies anywhere on earth. So where are the Japanese? Where are the French? Where are the Brits? Where are the Germans? I mean, they should, I hope the Dutch, for example, will all be building momentum for a case like this to be taken to the United Nations. I don't think, therefore, that they're simply bought off by the commercial interests. I mean, that's part of what keeps them quiet, of course, but none of them, I think, are certainly not as brazen in their comments and probably not in their thoughts as President Trump was when he said openly that, yeah, we've got all these arms deals we have to worry about preserving, and therefore we have to ignore our values. I don't think that the leaders of Western Europe or of Japan think in those terms. So hopefully we'll see them become more vocal.
And yet they haven't. I mean, it's been 3 months now, over 100 days, and they haven't become more vocal. How do you explain that, Rami?
I explain it by saying that there are issues related to sovereignty in some cases that simply cannot be overcome. The Saudis are a sovereign country. They do a lot of things that the world criticizes, that I criticize, that Jamal criticized, but they are in the end a sovereign country. They can circle the wagons and refuse to deal with any of these external investigations. There's a lot of people in the world who think that the President of the United States is a dangerous person for the world on things like climate change and other issues and trade, but they can't demand that the American president change his Secretary of State or change his vice president. So the sovereignty issue really comes into play here, and this is an obstacle that the world has endured over the last 40, 50 years in trying to push the Arab countries towards more pluralistic, tolerant, and consultative and accountable governance systems, and has had zero impact in doing this. It was only the Arab uprisings that pushed one country, Tunisia, into a democratic transformation. So this is a real problem. If a country refuses to do something that is related to its internal behavior, and this is what the Saudis see this as, then it's sometimes impossible to make them change. Unless intense pain can be brought to bear if the entire world decides no longer to trade with Saudi Arabia, which is not going to happen, but something really intense, or the Saudi leadership wants to make official visits and the other countries say, we refuse to meet with you unless you show us Jamal Khashoggi's body. Unless something like that happens, there may be a point at which the world can say, look, we can't do anymore.
All right. David Hay, I mean, there is some form of justice that has kicked off. I mean, this trial in Saudi Arabia, even if, you know, a lot of people are not hopeful about what it will achieve, a possible verdict also in Turkey in absentia. And then what? What else do you see happening here as far as justice is concerned?
Like I said, I think the UN is perhaps the most favoured option. But as we've seen in the case of in Argentina, now the Crown Prince travels widely, and if Trump and the UN don't come to the right conclusions, then there are ways and means in which using universal jurisdiction and various other aspects, other countries can at the very least make it very difficult on the Crown Prince to travel. And going forward, and I think it's a very interesting area to be in at the moment, because, as I said at the beginning, you've got so many commercial interests and other vested interests, and they are obviously affecting the justice that Jamal will receive.
All right, Matthew, in Istanbul. Istanbul is, of course, where this horrible crime was committed. 100 days on, would you say the dust has settled on this case?
I don't think it's settled inside the Turkish government based on the senior leaders I know. But in a metaphorical sense, unfortunately, it has. I mean, there hasn't been much coverage about it, not even here on Al Jazeera. You guys really kept the flame alive longer than anybody. This 100-day anniversary helps. But I'm afraid you're right that the dust has settled to a certain degree, notwithstanding the civil society activity that Rami mentioned. But I think we're in grave danger of that justice never being paid, because there's not a strong power in the world right now. You often played the role played by the U.S. that's willing to get everybody organized and get pushing. So I worry that this will fade away, and you know what everybody considers justice, who's listened to what the CIA's conclusion is that there would be consequences personally for the Crown Prince, whether it be a legal verdict or political pain or embarrassment. People were dreaming that maybe he'd lose his Crown Prince status. That's not going to happen. I think how we define justice in this case is important, although, of course, we would like those full legal consequences and political consequences to be meted out.
All right, Rami, Khoury in Beirut, I'll ask you, I'll give you the last word. Matthew says he worries that this will fade. How do we keep the flame alive? How do we ensure that Western governments are accountable and that we ensure that they're not giving the green light for such an action to happen again?
It's very hard to come up with a strategy to ensure that justice will be done, but I think in this case we have a few pointers that we might look at. For one thing, Saudi society is a society that, unlike all Arab societies and most societies in the world, but particularly the Saudis, they put a lot of importance on honor, their national honor. If the honor of Saudi Arabia is besieged, besmirched, and hurt by constant international attention to what they have done, a lot of Saudis may feel intensely angry and humiliated by what's going on, and possibly there may be internal pressure in Saudi Arabia. The other thing is the international experience with the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, the international movement now for the BDS legislation to protest the Israeli colonization and policies. If international intense pressure keeps building up, it's possible that that also could at some point trigger a slow change within Saudi Arabia. We're not going to see a fast change where the king suddenly changes the crown prince, but you might see a whittling away of his powers, possibly. You might see other people starting to speak up in Saudi Arabia. The problem is they're all afraid. They're all afraid of being chopped up with a bone saw and having their body parts dissolved in acid, as happened to Jamal Khashoggi. So perhaps some television station around the world or some civil society group will do a simulation of what happens when you chop up a body and put it in acid. And of course, just a real simulation, not the real thing. And this would bring great anger to Saudis and shame to a lot of Saudis and a lot of Muslims and Arabs around the world. And things like that possibly might come up one day and create a shock
Let's
that
hope
brings
that
about the
people
change.
don't forget about Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. Matthew, Bryza, Rami, Khoury, and David Hay. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thank you for watching. Bye for now.